let me introduce Professor Ramankutty. I mean, he doesn't need probably any introduction. If you work with the food system, sustainability, agriculture, you just Google him, look at his Google Scholar profile, you will know much more than what I'll tell you. But certainly, I can say that he's currently professor at University of British Columbia and also the Canada Research Chair in Global Environmental Change and Food Security. And he uses global data and models to explore strategies for sustainable food systems. He has contributed immensely in the scientific assessment, including the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, IPCC, IPBES. He is co-chair of the Global Land Program. He has been an associate editor of Environmental Research Letters, which is ERL, and Global Food Security, Global Ecology and Biogeography. And he is an Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellow. He was awarded with the 2020 Bihuri International Prize. So with this very short and brief introduction, let's everybody please welcome Professor Navin Ramankutty. Navin, floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vimal, Vimal and the Center for inviting me to give this seminar. I want to start by saying that my hearts are with all of you during this heat wave in India. As we think about sustainability and its challenges, I mean, the experiences that we are facing is sort of front and center in our minds. I also want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to give this seminar for multiple reasons. One, when I was a teenager growing up in India, in my engineering college, I, like many other people, wrote the IIT JEE, and I did not get in. So I feel like it's an opportunity now, at least, to come and give you a seminar, visit the IIT virtually. And second, as Vimal mentioned, the really amazing thing about giving these with the pandemic, that we are able to give these seminars virtually, is that people can watch it from anywhere. And so I left India in 1991, and I think today my mother is watching from Coimbatore. So I'm really delighted that she can do it. So hi, Mom. Hi, Amma, I should say. Okay. So my talk today is on exploring solutions to our food system challenges. I'll take about 30 to 40 minutes to kind of give a broad brush overview of the kind of work I do, and then can address questions during Q&A. This is a map of the world's agricultural lands. It shows that a third of our world's land is taken up by growing crops, which are shown in green colors, or for grazing animals, which are shown in kind of orange colors. Some of the work that our group does is in developing these kinds of data. This was developed by both blending remote sensing satellite data, as well as ground-based agricultural census statistics. And as you can see, most of the places in the world where we are able to grow crops are pretty much already in agriculture. The only places that are left behind are either the dry deserts, or the cold northern high latitudes, or the places that are kind of inaccessible. Most of the tropical rainforests are still there, but as you might know, these last sort of remaining cultivable lands are being rapidly cleared for agriculture. So for example, in Brazil, you see ongoing deforestation for growing soybeans and cattle. In Malaysia and Indonesia, we have ongoing deforestation for oil palm and so on. So most of the world's land is already in agriculture, and the last remaining kind of cultivable areas are rapidly being cleared. But that's only one side of the story. The other side of the story is sort of intensification. So over the last 300 years, we've had large cropland and pasture land expansion. But in the last 50 years, the story has been slightly different, and it's been the story of what you might very popularly know as the Green Revolution. So through intensification of our lands, through using irrigation, fertilizers, mechanization, pesticides, and so on, we've increased the amount of food that we produce on the amount of land we have. So it's kind of, we're producing more food on the same area of land. If you look at, say, corn yield, maize yield in the United States, for example, where we have data going back to 1800s, the yields were around 1.5 tons per hectare back in 1800s, and now we are reaching about 12 tons per hectare today. So that's a massive kind of, my slides are not moving forward, a massive like 7 times increase in yields. So essentially we're producing 7 times more food on the same land in the United States as we did before. We have the same kind of data for India. This is just going back over the last 60 years or so, and you can see that both rice yields and wheat yields have increased by 2 to 3 times over the last 60 years. This means that the amount of calories produced per person has actually increased since 1960. So in 1960, in terms of on average, we were producing about 2,200 calories per person. In 2020, we are producing close to 3,000 calories per person. It doesn't mean that everyone is much better fed, but in terms of our production capacity, we are producing more calories per person than we ever did, in spite of population growth going up. That means that as the number of people on our planet increased from 5 billion people in 1990 to almost 7.5, reaching 8 billion people today, at the same time, the number of undernourished people has declined slightly. There are still about 800 million people who are undernourished, but as a terms of proportion of number of people, that's declined a lot. So in some ways, we can say that this is an enormous success, that as our numbers continue to grow up, we've continued to produce more calories per person. We've actually decreased the number of undernourished. But this success comes at a huge cost. One of the costs is kind of major global environmental challenges that are associated with agriculture. So biodiversity loss, water use. This image shows an image of the Aral Sea from 1987 and more recently, and you can see that the Aral Sea has been completely depleted. And part of the reason is because the rivers that are feeding the Aral Sea have been diverted to irrigate cotton. And we also have examples of water pollution around the world. This is an image showing an algal bloom. When we apply nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers on our agricultural lands, some of it is taken up by the plants, but a whole bunch of it runs off or is eroded and enters our aquatic systems. And when they enter aquatic systems, those systems are limited by these nutrients, and so results in excess algal growth. And when these algae die later on, they can also deplete oxygen in these coastal ecosystems. So if you think about climate change, we usually think about fossil fuel production. We think about buildings, heating buildings, transportation, and so on. But agriculture is a huge contributor to the climate change problem also. When you deforest lands, as I earlier mentioned, in Brazil and Indonesia, Malaysia, that releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. When we have animals or when we have rice paddies, those kinds of systems where we have anaerobic decomposition, we have methane releases. Methane is also a greenhouse gas, and it's a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. And when we apply fertilizers on the land, we talked about the eutrophication problem due to excess nutrient release, but some of that nitrogen also turns into nitrous oxide, which is an even more powerful greenhouse gas. So when we put all of these together and we ask, we take the catalog of global environmental problems and ask, what's the role of agriculture in these problems? It turns out that agriculture plays a huge role. So in terms of the climate change problem, about a quarter of our greenhouse gas emissions comes from agriculture. That's CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide put together. When you look at biodiversity loss, agriculture is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss on this planet. About 60% of our threats to birds, when we're talking about extinction threats, 60% of threats to birds is known to be because of agriculture. Sorry, the number is wrong there. 70% of withdrawal of fresh water is for agriculture and 85% of consumptive use. In terms of water pollution, the eutrophication problem that I talked about, the algal bloom problem, about nearly 80% of our algal bloom problems is because of agriculture. So we have a huge climate change problem, but we also have a huge environmental problem related to agriculture. We need to be, as we solve the climate change problem, we also need to keep in mind that we have this environmental problem related to agriculture that we also need to solve in the long run. But the problem of feeding people is not over. I've talked about how our green revolution has been a huge success in kind of terms of producing more calories per person. But yet about 800 million people remain undernourished. And there are very high degrees of undernourishment, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in other kind of poorer nations around the world. And so we need to continue working on this problem of feeding people. On top of that, it's estimated that we'll need even more food into the future. As our numbers grow into the future, there are estimates that we will get to potentially 10 billion people by 2100. And more people are, as they're becoming wealthier, are also consuming higher up the food chain, which is a very inefficient way of consuming our calories. So by some estimates, by 2050, we'll need to double our food availability. And so a huge number of scientists around the world, including myself, have been asking this kind of important question, which is how can we continue to increase food availability or food security to the future, while at the same time we need to reduce the environmental footprint of agriculture. The agriculture we have today, it's already a huge threat to the environment. How can we reduce that footprint while at the same time increasing food availability? And if you follow this literature or even kind of popular articles written on this topic, you see that there are a huge number of solutions that people talk about. Some of the most common ones are like, maybe we should switch our agriculture to organic agriculture. The reason we have these environmental problems is because of our industrial agriculture, using all these fertilizers and nutrients and pesticides and so on. Others talk about switching to a new kind of system called agroecology, which is not just about how we farm, but also taking power away from industries and so on. Others talk about sustainable intensification, which is to say, we don't need to dramatically change the way we farm. We just need to do it a little bit more sustainably. Yet others talk about genetically modified foods as being a solution. Or maybe we talk about how our cities could be used for farming. So people talk about urban agriculture or vertical farms where we grow our food in big, tall towers. Others talk about maybe shifting our demand side systems, that maybe if we switch to becoming vegetarians or vegans, that can be part of the solution. Or maybe we eat more insects, eating more locally, reducing food waste, and so on. Others talk about changing the power dynamics in the system and talk about food sovereignty. Yet others say that smallholders, smaller farms are better than larger farms. And so if you stop kind of land consolidation and do more land distribution, we can have more sustainable agriculture. For myself and for a whole bunch of people, when you're exposed to this kind of literature, it can be quite bewildering. Which of these solutions really are effective, which ones scale up, and so on. So one of the some of the type of work that my research group, my students and I do is to kind of examine across these kinds of solutions, like what do we really know about them in terms of information that's out there, and can these kinds of solutions scale up? So today I'm going to talk about three of the kinds of solutions that my group, my collaborators and students and I have examined. We're going to look at sustainable intensification, organic and urban agriculture. Start with talking about sustainable intensification. It essentially means trying to do more with less. So you might hear the terms, more crop per drop, or producing more crops per nutrient, so improving nutrient use efficiency and so on. One of the ways people have talked about sustainable intensification is this idea of closing yield gaps. This is a map showing yield gaps, but I'll first describe what that means. So we have a distribution of yields around the world. Some places in the world are producing higher yields, some places in the world are producing lower yields. when you look at that kind of geographic distribution and then ask, why is that? One of the reasons the yields are different is because the climate is different, the soils are different. But another reason that the yields are so different is because the management practices are different. So some places we are doing more intensive management, we're using more water, more nutrients, and other places not. So sometimes people talk about yield gaps as saying, if you had the same climate and soil in two different parts of the world and the yields are different, that yield gap is a result of management practices. So using kind of data and models, this is my former research group, my PhD supervisor and I and several others did this study where we tried to kind of take the data and normalize yields for the climate and soil effects. So essentially, we tried to build models which say, if you had the same climate and soils in two different parts of the world, can we try to normalize for that difference? And then the difference in yield that you see remaining is the difference due to management. So those are the yield gaps here shown in this map. The greenish colors show smaller yield gaps and the reddish colors show higher yield gaps. And you can see that in many parts of the world, like North America, Western Europe, many parts of India and China, where we already have fairly intense cultivation, there are smaller yield gaps, but the much higher yield gaps in places like Sub-Saharan Africa or Eastern Europe. And the idea is that if you can close these yield gaps, you can actually improve a lot of increase your amount of available calories. So depending on how much of the yield gaps that you close in this particular study, we estimated that we can close yield gaps by 30 to 60%. But we have to do this in a smarter way. Closing yield gaps means increasing the amount of fertilizer, increasing the amount of nutrients. So in the same study or a related study, we actually looked at, can we close these yield gaps in a sustainable way? So that's what sustainable intensification means. Intensification is simply increasing the inputs like nutrients and fertilizers, nutrients and irrigation to improve yields. Sustainable intensification is trying to do more with less. And so in this study, which is sort of a hypothetical study, we asked, some places in the world, we seem to be using more nutrients, and other places in the world, we seem to be using less nutrients. So it's what sometimes people call a Goldilocks problem, which is that as we apply more and more fertilizer to the soil, yields go up, but we have diminishing marginal returns, which means that as we apply more and more, yields don't go up at the same rate. They start slowing down. So you have diminishing marginal returns. And so in some places in the world, applying an additional unit of fertilizer gets very little gain in terms of yields. But in other places in the world, we can get a huge bang for the buck by increasing yields. So in this particular hypothetical scenario, what we did was to kind of shift our nitrogen fertilizer around. So in sort of the green regions in this map, we are saying that we can actually apply less nitrogen and not have a huge loss of yields because you're already maxed out in terms of, you're already saturated in your nitrogen response. But in these red regions are places we can actually get a huge bang for the buck by increasing nitrogen. So by doing this kind of optimization, sort of hypothetical, of course, we estimated that we can actually increase food production by about 30% with only a 9% increase in nitrogen. So you can get a higher kind of efficiency in terms of nutrient use efficiency. So this is what sustainable intensification means. But then we can try to put this back into the framework of, what does this mean for kind of food and environment? And I tried to do this in this kind of very simple assessment. As you just saw, sustainable intensification or closing yield gaps can increase food availability by something like 30%. But even though you're doing more for less, you are actually adding more nitrogen to the system, and you're actually making the climate change problem a little bit worse. You're not making it as worse because of the efficiency improvement, but climate change is still becoming better. Your biodiversity loss because of the intensification will probably be much worse. Don't have a good quantitative assessment for that, but we sure know that as you intensify agriculture, it'll be harmful for ecosystems. Increase water use by about 25% in order to do the sustainable intensification, and adding nitrogen to the system increases eutrophication as well. So yes, this is sustainable intensification, but we haven't achieved our original goal of producing more food while reducing the environmental footprint. We are producing more food while actually increasing the environmental footprint somewhat less. So this is a good thing to do, but it's not a solution to our problem. So let's now say, okay, maybe we shouldn't be even looking at conventional food systems. Maybe we should be thinking about radically shifting to something like organic farming. And as you know, this is happening in many parts of the world. Recent controversy about organic farming in Sri Lanka, for example. But organic farming can be beneficial. So one of my former PhD students and I decided to examine, what do we know about organic farming and its, benefits and pros and cons. We did a meta-analysis and a systematic review of the literature, and essentially looked at a whole bunch of different environmental variables. We also looked at a whole bunch of social variables, socioeconomic variables. I'm not going to talk about that today, unless you want to know in the Q&A. But we, in this case, we looked at a whole bunch of environmental variables that we care about. This red circle is kind of the baseline. So you can say that in this flower diagram, if any of the petals lies inside the red circle, organic agriculture is worse than conventional agriculture. If the petals lie outside the red circle, then organic agriculture is better than conventional agriculture. And so we found in this assessment that organic agriculture does seem to have a whole bunch of environmental benefits. So it seems to have a 10% higher species richness and 48% greater abundance. That means it's better for biodiversity. It has 11% higher soil organic matter, which means it's better for the soil health. It has less nitrogen loss and not so different for phosphorus loss, but it's better for this eutrophication problem. It has less nitrous oxide emissions, so it's better for climate change. Methane emissions were the only one where it was worse. It also uses less energy, and so also good for climate change. So overall, we found that organic agriculture can have environmental benefits. But one of the big criticisms of organic agriculture is like, yeah, well and good, it produces more, it has environmental benefits, it's better for the environment, but it produces less food. And so one thing that you commonly hear people say is like organic has lower yields. And so we did another study where we tried to ask, how do the yields of organic and conventional agriculture compare? And to do that, again, we did a meta-analysis where we found 66 different studies of organic and conventional yields. These are experiments done around the world where people have one organic plot and another conventional plot and compare the yields. And the meta-analysis is essentially a statistical method that compares across all of those different studies and say, on average, what do we know what organic versus conventional? And we did find that, as people argue, that organic agriculture does have lower yields. We found about 25% lower yields on average for organic compared to conventional. What was quite interesting in the study is that we actually found that the yield gap between organic and conventional can be very different depending on the system. And in fact, if you're using best management practices, or when you look at systems that are using best organic practices, yield gaps can be minimized. But in all of these cases, the yields of organic is always lower than conventional. So that's a trade-off. So essentially, with organic agriculture, you can have environmental benefits, but you have lower yields. So you put that back into our assessment here, you can see that for all the environmental rows here, climate change, biodiversity, water pollution, and so on, the organic agriculture, as I showed you in the flower diagram, does have environmental benefits. On the other hand, you're going to be producing less food. So now you have the flip side solution to sustainable intensification. We have environmental benefits, but now you have less food. We need to do both of those things well. We need to produce more food and lower the environmental footprint. So then we say, okay, what about urban farming, right? Maybe we can take some pressure off our lands by growing food in urban areas. This is a very simple thought experiment, shows that while urban farming can have lots of benefits, it just doesn't scale up. A total area of the world that's in urban areas is about 0.5%. Our total global cropland extent is 12% of the world's land. So we have over 24 times more land in agriculture than in urban areas. So if you want to produce the same amount of food that we currently produce in croplands in urban areas, it means that we need about 24 times higher yields. So my students and I actually try to do a kind of, the thought experiment itself tells you that it cannot scale up, but we try to actually do an estimate country by country to see, how much can urban agriculture do. And in this particular study, all we did was a simple thought experiment. Again, we said, let's take all the urban areas in every part of the world and ask how much land do we need simply to grow the recommended amounts of fruits and vegetables. And this is because urban agriculture is mainly used for producing fruits and veggies, not for major grains. Even just to produce the recommended amount of fruits and vegetables to have a healthy diet, many parts of the world, we can't even do that. The red colors here show where you need greater than 100% available urban area to produce just the amount of fruits and vegetables that people need. So urban agriculture, even though it can have lots of benefits, it just does not scale up. Again, if you put it back into the assessment, our assessment that was that with urban agriculture, maybe you can increase food production by 4%. Plus, we don't actually have a good assessment of all the environmental benefits that it has. So this is all kind of research that I have done over the last 10 to 15 years. But when I put it back into this assessment of, can we actually improve food availability by reducing its environmental footprint, I find that we are kind of fiddling at the margins. Like we can make things slightly better, but we are not addressing that kind of big transformative solution that we need of increasing food while reducing its footprint. So that got me thinking about, can these kind of supply side solutions where we try to change the food system sustainability problem by simply focusing on changing the way we do our agriculture, is that really going to play a big role? Or do we need to actually think about demand side solutions? We very rarely do we actually think about maybe we need to constrain ourselves and our human food consumption. There are two major solutions that people talk about when we think about demand side solutions. And one is to shift diets away from grain-fed meat. About third of the grain that we produce on the planet, in some of the best climate and best soils on this planet, we take all of that grain and we feed them to animals to grow livestock, which we then later eat. That's not a very efficient way to get our calories. And I'll get to that in a second. The other major thing that we can focus on is reducing food waste. About a third of the world's food is wasted. And so reducing food waste can also be a huge part of the solution. I'm going to talk mostly about shifting diets today and what it can do. I'm very cognizant that this is in a very different context that I'm talking about. This shifting diets idea may not actually apply to the Indian context. It's a context that applies to mostly North American and European situations, just because how different our diets are. But the basic idea is this with shifting diets. Let's say you are eating a veggie burger, and to produce that veggie burger, you need a certain amount of plant material. And let's say that's the amount of plant material you need. But instead, let's say you wanted to get the same amount of calories, but you wanted to do that by eating a chicken burger. Okay, so you need a certain amount of chicken to produce that chicken burger, but that chicken needs to be fed. And it turns out that you need about roughly three times more grain to feed that chicken to get the same amount of calories. Instead, let's say you eat a hamburger. Well, to feed that cow, you need maybe 10 times as much calories. And this is simply a function of our what's known as the food chain. So essentially, it's as you eat higher and higher up the trophic level, there's a huge amount of efficiency loss. Essentially because the chicken and the cow spend a lot of the energy keeping themselves alive, moving around, and so on. So it's a less efficient way to gain your calories, even though eating meat does provide a whole bunch of critical nutrients. But if you can shift our diets away from some of these, from meat eating, we can solve a huge amount of problems. As I said earlier, this in the Indian context, this is not a huge problem, but in North America and Europe, it's estimated that people already get most of their protein and nutrients from plant-based diets already. And we are eating maybe 2 times as much meat as is recommended. So the World Health Organization recommends that we eat about 40 grams of meat per day. In North America and Europe, people are eating close to 80 grams of meat per day. If you kind of do an assessment of, how calories flow in our current food production system, of all the crops that we grow, only about 55% of calories from all of those crops are going directly to humans. About 36% of those calories are diverted to animals. And out of that 36%, only 4% in terms of actual calories comes back in terms of meat. So total of, out of 100% of calories that are being produced on our cropland, only 55 plus 4, about 60% comes back in terms of calories. Another 9% is diverted away to kind of industrial uses like biofuels and other industrial products. So essentially, of all the crops that are being produced on the planet, 100% of our crop calories being produced, only 60% is delivered in terms of human calories. We can look at this in many different ways. You look at it by crop, you can see the biggest crop we grow on this planet is maize. That's the one on the bottommost. And the total bar, the full bar, is the amount of calories that are being produced. The green bar is the amount of calories that are being delivered. And you can see for maize, a very small fraction of calories that are being produced is actually delivered to humans. That's not the case for wheat and rice. Most of wheat and rice is actually eaten by humans. And so you can see that much larger portion of that is being delivered. You'll see the consequences of this in the next map. Same thing with oil palm and soybean. A large fraction of oil palm and soybean is not used for human calories. Oil palm is used for many industrial products like chocolate, and soybean is also fed to animals. If you put this in a map form and ask, of all the crops being produced on the planet, how much is actually fed to humans, you can see that in North America and Europe, far fewer food calories being delivered from those crops, while in sub-Saharan Africa, India, and China, most of the food that's being produced in those places actually go towards human calories. This is a huge bang for the buck. If you just do a hypothetical kind of thought experiment and ask, what if you all became vegans and only ate no meat or dairy? We can increase calories by about 70% by doing this shift. That's a big bang for the buck. It says that even if you don't eat meat just one day a week, you can be part of 10% of the solution. So that kind of work has really blossomed in the last 5 years or so. There's recently been work from the Eat Lancet report, where a whole bunch of ecologists as well as kind of health scientists got together to ask, what does a diet looks like that's good for human health, but also good for the planet. And this is something called the Planetary Health Diet, a report that came out maybe a couple of years ago. And you can see that a planetary health diet this is what a typical plate should look like. And about half your plate should be with fruits and vegetables. And another quarter or so should be made out of whole grains. And we might get our protein from animal sourced protein, but we also want to get a whole bunch of our protein from plant-based foods and so on. They actually came out with recommendations for what, in terms of calories as well as in terms of weight, what your average diet should look like in terms of having whole grains versus tubers and starchy tubers and starches and fruits and meat and so on. Another example is the Canada Food Guide that was also released a few years ago. This is what the Canada Food Guide says your plate should look like. And again, it follows similar principles. We should eat more fruits and vegetables. And if you eat protein, a quarter of your plate should be protein, but try to eat more plant-based. When you use grains, maybe eat more whole grain food. And again, this was a blend of both. When the Canada Food Guide developed this, they were actually focused on health outcomes. But a diet that's good for the health can be good for the environment as well. And this is shown from another study looking at the global burden of disease. And a few years ago, again, published in Lancet, they looked at they looked at the global burden on disease from diet. And this shows a ranking in terms of, what are the biggest causes of either mortality rates on the left or the number of deaths at the global level on the right. And what are the diet-related consequences of mortality? And the highest one, if you can read it, says it's diets high in sodium, so high salt intake is the biggest cause of diet-related mortality. But the next few items are all related to things that I've just talked about. Diets low in whole grains, diet low in fruit, diets low in nuts and seeds and vegetables are some of the highest causes of mortality on our planet. So all in all, like eating more plant-based foods can not only be good for the planet, but it's also good for your health. And so sort of a summary message from my talk is that leveraging both supply and demand side solutions can actually more effectively address our food systems challenges. I want to kind of conclude my talk by talking about this paper and idea that came from an energy system. Amory Lovins is a very well-known kind of energy policy thinker. And back in the 1970s, he wrote a paper or a book called Soft Energy Paths. And he was focusing on the US system, and he was talking about how to tackle the energy challenge in the United States, the policy proposals are all about building more and more power plants, so more coal-fired power plants or more thermal power plants. And he was talking about, those are hard path solutions. Those are solutions where as demand goes up, you think about producing more and more supply. And he was talking about an idea called soft path solutions, where he suggested that maybe as we do this kind of energy transition, maybe we need to think about reducing our demand by improving energy efficiency. And maybe we need to be thinking about producing our energy through more renewables. So instead of a hard path solution, can we follow a soft path? And I think the same kind of idea can also apply to food system challenges. And in a recent study, we proposed that instead of having this argument about alternate versus conventional food systems and agriculture, maybe we can follow soft path solutions to food systems, focused on reducing overall demand a little bit, but we can reduce our dietary excess by not eating too much, shifting to plant-based diets, not diverting a lot of our valuable crops to biofuels. Maybe we can improve efficiency in the food system, improving nutrient and water use efficiency, as we talked about with sustainable intensification, but also by improving reducing food loss and waste in the system. And finally, we can also think about focusing on kind of the equivalent of renewables. We can try to think about making our agriculture more environmentally friendly through our organic agroecological regenerative. But the bottom line message is in order to achieve our food system challenges, picking any one of these is not enough. We need to be addressing all of these at the same time. Thank you very much. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah. So thank you for this wonderful talk. And it was very simple, very informative. And I learned a lot, and I hope everybody enjoyed.